Hello, hello! I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and story nerd, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is one that I have been working on for a long time because my current project is involving a big ensemble cast. And so I wanted to see how numerous different stories introduced their ensemble cast. It's a big challenge because you have a lot of people you need to introduce all at once. They're all pretty important to your story, and it can be hard for the audience to remember them all at once when they're all showing up. And so I thought it would be interesting to go through 4 different stories that all have what I would say is an ensemble cast. That's not saying that they don't necessarily have one main character, although for some of them, I'm honestly not sure who that is. It's not just a story with a large cast. There's my dog. Hi, Oscar. It's not just a story with a large cast, but a story where the ensemble is super important. You're often seeing things from multiple perspectives, multi-POVs. All right, so I'm going to be talking about 2 TV shows and 2 books that have good ensemble casts. So I'm going to be doing Money Heist, the TV show, the Spanish one, Six of Crows, the book by Lee Bardugo, Downton Abbey, the TV show, and the Mother-Daughter Book Club, which is a book by Heather something. So let us get right on into this. Now, Money Heist is very much an ensemble cast. Who was the main character? I mean, the first few seasons, and I haven't actually seen the final season, to be fair, the first few seasons are, I would say Tokyo is maybe the main character. She does the voiceover, but arguably the professor is the main character. But again, all of the people have very solid stories. So, if you go on my website, you're going to be able to download or access my Google Sheet where I have all of this information, but let's get into it. So the first character that we see is Tokyo. We actually see her waking up super startled, which is, generally a cliche in writing, but because she wakes up and points a gun at the door, I think that really helps overcome the cliche. She turns on the TV and she watches herself on the news and sees the imagery of the love of her life in a pool of blood. And she's voiceovering, explaining all of this. She's on the run, and clearly, she puts stuff on, and she's like, it's been 9 days, I gotta go. She goes to a payphone, and she calls her mom, basically to say goodbye. She's planning on going to Asia or something to get herself out of there. Another question to ask is, how would an audience perceive her based on her actions there? The first few minutes are really just her talking. There's nobody else. It does give you a sense. It shows you, first of all, that she's a criminal. The gun, there are lots of guns in this, so that establishes the tone really early. It establishes that she has emotional problems a little bit, that she has heartbreak, but also the fact that she calls her mom shows that she does care about people. The next person we see is the professor. This happens a few minutes in. He drives up in a sedan to save her from the police. Basically, she's on a payphone. She's planning on going to her mom's. She drives up, and he's like, get in. She points a gun at his crotch, and he keeps his cool and is very polite. He says, may I? As in, may I take the gun from you? This gives us a sense that he is unperturbed by violence, unperturbed by guns, that he is very in control. She calls him her guardian angel from the very beginning, so we know that he is a good character. And also, just a note, he establishes the goal absolutely immediately. Do you want to be a part of the biggest heist in history, basically? Do you want to be a part of a heist for billions of dollars? Some interesting lines here, actually, are she says at the end of that little sequence, that scene, if I'm going to be in the news again, at least it will be for the biggest heist in history. And I think that gives you a really good sense of her character. Now, the rest of the characters are revealed in kind of, I'd say there's 3 different scenes. There's the first one, which is the professor talking to everyone in the classroom. and there's a sense of him sharing the plan, of people expressing little bits of their personalities. The second scene, there's actually a flash of like the person's mugshots, information about them, and she literally tells you who they are and what their role is in the heist. And then the third bit, Tokyo says something like, I was thinking of all the people whose lives we were going to change that day. And there's a little bit of a snapshot of some other important characters. So let's talk this over. So our first impression of Denver, we see him snorting, laughing. He has teasing and banter with Moscow, who then he's revealed to be Moscow's son. He is the third person in the mugshot slideshow. Key takeaways are drugs, busted teeth, broken ribs, king of bar fights, and she calls him a ticking time bomb as his role. All right, so then going in the order of when someone talks, basically, in this big group scene, the next person to talk after Denver, so Denver's the first person to say anything other than the professor and Tokyo in the big group scene when they're in the classroom. Then Moscow is next, and he is questioning the professor's plan a little bit. He points out problems with the name thing. They're trying to think of like ways to name each other so they don't know each other, basically. I think he says, I can't remember my phone number. How am I supposed to remember people's names? He also says, 5 months of preparation. Are you crazy? So he kind of comes off as, the older, more grandfatherly, even though he's not quite that old figure here. He is second in the reels of mugshots. She identifies him as the one coughing and the expert with all the industrial tools. Fifth to speak is Rio. He has banter with Denver. I think he says something about like, I'll be Mars, he's Uranus, or something like that. Tokyo really introduces him by her kind of gazing at him in the classroom, and then she says the words, he is my weakness. In the reels, he's identified as the Mozart of computers. Then we have Berlin, who's sixth. He speaks sixth. Tokyo identifies him as a wanted man all over the world and the one looking at her ass. Again, she's very funny. She's very sarcastic. She's very blunt, which is amazing. His reel is just an account of his crimes, including his biggest score, and she identifies him as he was in charge of the heist. A lot of characters we need to know all at once. It's not subtle. It's a rote. It's literally mugshots voiceover, and us hearing her opinions of them. I think this could have gone really, really poorly. If you think about it in a book sense, just sitting there and describing every character in the room in a paragraph, which is basically what she does, can be boring. A little more organic is the next scene after she says, all the innocent people whose lives would stop because of us. We meet Monica, who is taking a pregnancy test, immediately gain empathy for her because we know that her life is about to stop and her life is changing. We see a 17-year-old girl who is the lamb, whose name I can't remember at the moment, but she's sitting alone on a bus journaling. We see ballet shoes in her bag, so we see that she has a life. We see her make cute eyes at a boy who holds her hand and then kisses her, and it's like, oh, like she's going through that first crush, first relationship kind of things. Again, we really empathize with her immediately. And then we see Arturo. We see him walking through the halls. We see him going up behind Monica, saying a cheesy line. And then he reacts blankly, like literally like, I'm finding out that she's pregnant. And so we immediately don't like him. And so those kind of secondary characters who become more important later in the episode and later in the series are introduced in a more organic way that either helps us immediately gain empathy for them or immediately dislike them. Crows is next. And of course, this is super, super different because this is a book rather than a TV show, obviously. So it's different. Interestingly about Six of Crows, and of course this is done all the time, is that none of the main characters are introduced until the second chapter. The first chapter is really identifying our problem, the something Perem, the Jurda Perem. So the first person we're introduced to who is a main character is Kaz, and that is from Inej's point of view, and she is basically describing him. And I'm pretty sure the first lines of that chapter are, Kaz Brecker didn't need a reason. Those were the words whispered on the streets of Ketterdam in the taverns and coffee houses. And then there's a bit more setting. And then it says, the boy they called Dirty Hands didn't need a reason any more than he needed permission. So very interestingly, this whole second chapter is basically a mini heist unto itself. It's a confrontation between two gangs with a lot of banter. And it basically is, you know how they say, make your first chapter a mini version of your whole novel? That's the first or second chapter of Six of Crows. And it's really, I think, all about getting to Kaz, because I would argue Kaz is the main character here. So in this scene, it seems like Kaz is losing because Big Bollinger goes down, and then there's a twist, and we see that Kaz is really in charge and has been all along. So interesting, and we see this done in lots of different shows where the main character, the person who's kind of a mythic figure, is introduced from someone else's perspective rather than starting from their own perspective. I was listening to Shonda Rhimes' masterclass in, she talks about this in Scandal, how in order to build Olivia's character up, the first scene is just people talking about how great Olivia is. And that really sets her up as being larger than life. This is very similar. Before we see Kaz in action, we hear Inej's perspective on what people think of Kaz, which is almost a few degrees away. But that's what we hear. Inej is introduced next in the second chapter after her musings about Kaz. So there's about 2 paragraphs about Kaz, and then she kind of comes into things. She's crossing a bridge, thinking about Kaz and questioning his reasoning in this situation. I wish you could see my dog's face right now because he's so cute. Oh my god. The interesting line here is that she's checking her knives. Again, something that's very prototypical, very like, yes, Inej, knives that you associate right away. In this chapter, she's skimming through rooftops, reading Kaz's mind, doing her job silently, and everything goes perfectly to Kaz's plan. Again, you really get a sense of her role and her relationship with Kaz, how close these people really are, because she's able to anticipate his needs, anticipate what he is going to do. Next, we hear about Jesper, who also is introduced in the second chapter in Inej's description of this scene. So interestingly, she's very much like, we have all of these people, and she lists some names, and then we have his seconds, Jesper and Big Bollinger. He is the first person to speak. He gives information about the ships and says that the shoe are there, and then he corrects Big Bollinger, and you really get a sense that he is like your like favorite criminal. Big Bollinger says something like, I would have liked to see that, and he corrects him. Jesper corrects him and says, I would have liked to steal that. And that's the first line of dialogue. My favorite line of dialogue from him in this chapter is, Kaz, this whole shoot me thing is starting to concern me. So you get that he's kind of a funny character, but also a character with a lot of depth and a lot of emotion. He's the one person who looks sad at Big Bollinger as he lies on the ground bleeding over the betrayal.
It's hard for you to put Milo.
Who's Milo?
The goat.
So there we are introduced to the kind of core 3, and then a whole bunch of sort of side characters, like there's another gang, there's, people in Kaz's gang, yada, yada, yada. And then there's quite a while before we are introduced to the other 3 characters. So we have Nina, who is introduced on page 73. Kaz goes to find her and is told Nina is with a client. So it's kind of hidden. Everything's sort of hidden what he's trying to do. And you don't see people see the rest of them until they actually go and meet them, because it's just kind of hidden from the audience. So in Nina's first scene, she's in a kefta, heart-rendering someone. And then there's a flashback about their conversation from before the book started about why she has a settee in her room and no bed. Again, really interesting, and it shows she has a lot of pizzazz, backbone, a lot of strength. She comes off as flirty. There's a great line that says, he'd once seen her make eyes at a pair of shoes she fancied in a shop window. But you also get that sort of strength, no nonsense, like well aware of the realities of the world kind of thing from her. Next is Matthias. His first introduction, he's mentioned on page 79 in a conversation between Nina and Kaz. The exact line is, how many times have I come to you begging you to help Matthias? Matthias? Maybe it's Matthias. Anyways, when we meet him for the first time in person, he growls and tries to strangle Nina. And that is very interesting because up till now she's been like, I'm asking you to help him. Like, help him. And to have the first thing that he does be try to hurt her it really creates intrigue for the characters and also shows their backstory together very, very well. And then finally we have Wylan, who I believe is introduced on page 117, although I may have missed a mention of him earlier. He is introduced to Matthias as the demolitions expert. Actually on page 117 we have a nice roundup of the crew and their duties, and this is basically Kaz and the others explaining to Matthias who everybody is, what their role is going to be in this heist. Wylan's dialogue is really all about his first impression. Sorry, baby. At the end of that chapter, it's revealed he is Van Eck's son. So we have something a little bit different, very different here between these two stories that are arguably somewhat similar. They're both heists with a big crew of people, right? So in Money Heist, we are introduced to all of the people maybe by like 10, 15 minutes in, like very early on, we are there and we know who they are. In Six of Crows, we don't know all of the characters who are going to be members of this heist until page 117, which is a long time. So it's interesting to think, like, why does this work? I think the reason it works is because literally in chapter 2 or chapter 3, Kaz and Inej go to Van Eck and they're given their goal, which is to capture the makers of Dirtaparam from, Fjorda. And so all of this, like, gathering the team, finding the people, introducing the characters, we tolerate it because we know it's all part of the goal, and we know, we trust Kaz. After that second chapter, we're like, I trust him. I know what we're doing. He has a plan. He always has a plan. It's also funny how Kaz and the professor have quite similar roles in the heist, or roles in this cast. The professor is very much the leader, as Kaz is the leader, the one pulling the strings, the mastermind. They both have the mastermind role. The professor is shown saving someone. She calls him her guardian angel. Kaz is shown killing the person that betrayed him or leaving the person that betrayed him to die, and in a little bit of a mini moment. Let's move on to another TV show. Let's move on to how they introduce characters in Downton Abbey. Now, this is very different indeed. So in both Money Heist and Six of Crows, we established the goal really early on. We learn a little bit about the characters, we establish a goal, we build the rest of the team. In Downton Abbey, it's almost like a full, like, through shot, where we see all of the characters before the problem is introduced. So it's the opposite. Basically, we have like the theme song going in the background, and the first thing we see is Mr. Bates, who's looking out a train window, and then the train stops, and then it kind of goes through the village. We go and we see that there is a telegram that's been sent, and we follow the telegram up to the main house. So we're getting a very big sense of setting. We're also getting a sense of something important is happening. When you put so much focus on one element, I think, like a telegram being sent, the audience obviously assumes, oh, this is important, this is going to be a big thing, and we follow it through, basically through the house, although with a little bit of weaving in and out. The next person we see who's an important character is Daisy. We see her knocking on the door, waking up the maids, and subsequently getting to her chores and carrying a ton of things in her arms. She is portrayed very, very sympathetically throughout this whole opening sequence. We feel a bit sorry for her as the audience. She's a young girl. She's being bossed around by everyone. She has absolutely no rest. Everyone's bossing her around. The third person we see is Anna. No, it's the maid who leaves, whose name I can't remember right now. She says, "Thank you, Daisy," and then she wakes Anna up. Names are trickled in here, one by one. We see Anna groggily getting out of bed. She says she wishes she could wake up naturally, which kind of gives you a sense of her position in the house and her status, I suppose. We see Mrs. Padmore fifth. She asks Daisy if she's finished all of her chores and then says to get started on the next chore. We see Thomas sixth. At some point he asks where William is, and then a little bit later on we meet William. Thomas snips at William, so we know that this is William. Mrs. Hughes, we've seen 7. She is carrying keys. She goes in and appraises the maid's work and then gives the next instructions. We can kind of tell that she is very much in charge here. She says things like, "You're building a fire, not inventing it," to Daisy. 8th, we see Mr. Carson, who's polishing silver. Mr. Carson tells William to get the ironing board out for the papers, but in a much nicer way than Thomas does. So again, we're seeing kind of the hierarchy of things here. We're seeing who's the lowest. There's somewhat of a pattern of seeing the least important from social order status all the way up to most important. First servant we see is Daisy, and the last one we see is Mr. Carson, who is the butler. I think they had a big challenge here of teaching us early 1900s rich household politics, and they use this pattern to really communicate it to us. Again, it's showing kind of a morning routine, which could be considered a cliche, but I think the use of the telegram and that kind of being the Chekhov's gun in the background of what's going to be in this telegram really pulls us through. The first person that we see from the family is Mary, and that's because the bell rings. Mrs. Padmore looks up the bell and says, "Lady Mary," and then we see Mary, who's sitting on the edge of her bed, rubbing her eyes. The sun comes in her window. We actually see her ring the bell, and then Mrs. Padmore says, "Lady Mary." So again, we can see that she is higher in the hierarchy. We see how the bell system works, how she calls people to help her. 10th, we see Miss O'Brien, who is refusing to help take trays around. She calls Daisy silly and references Daisy's dirty hands, again showing where she is in the hierarchy. We see Robert 11th, and the music does this fun thing to be like, here's Robert, the head of the household. And you can immediately tell he's the master of the house. Walking down the stairs, his dog trotting next to him, you can tell he is the star here. They're in the dining room, and then he hears about the Titanic. So Edith comes in, she's 12th, and she says things like, "When Anna told me, I thought she must have dreamt it," while talking to her father. Mary comes in behind her, so you see that they're on a similar level. You figure out quickly from their seating that they're sisters. She says things like, "I thought it was supposed to be unsinkable." Sybil comes in 13th. She takes the telegram from Thomas, greets her father, and passes over. You can see she has a soft voice. You can almost tell in that moment that she is the youngest. And then the very last person we see right before this like musical ends is Cora. There's a bunch of fanfare where Robert asks if her ladyship is awake, asks to enter her room. She's reading the newspaper and is commenting on how terrible it is in a sort of sad, detached sort of way, and then Robert tells the news that is kind of like the inciting incident, the triggering off point for the whole story, which is his heirs have passed away. Very interestingly, then you learn a lot about the characters because like their families passed away, nobody cries in this family. So a very different way of doing things than Money Heist. Arguably, it wouldn't have been possible to do the Money Heist thing with Downton Abbey because the cast is so much larger. And I'm not even sure who the main character is in Downton Abbey. I suppose maybe it's Robert. I kind of think it might be Mary, though. I think Mary would be the main character. She has main character energy, as the kids would say. Very important that everybody gets a moment. It's not just everyone's in one big conversation. Everybody gets a moment here, and there's a lot of use of names because you can't do it on the page, and so it's like name. I think for the first few minutes, everybody uses everyone's name, which would be stilted in a book, but felt fine in the TV show. So interesting. And then the final one that I have is the Mother-Daughter Book Club. Now, this is a middle grade novel that is very much an ensemble piece because all four girls are given equal time. It's about four girls. They're starting grade 6. By the end of the first chapter, their moms tell them that they're going to be in a mother-daughter book club together, and they become friends, and you follow them throughout the year. There's 4 seasons, and each girl has a chapter in each season. So, the first character we're introduced to is Emma in the very first chapter. She's getting on a bus while Becca yells mean things at her. She's being embarrassed on her first day of middle school. She starts to write a poem. She stews about how nervous she is. She barely gets through her school day. She's upset against the comments played against her, and then she's told about the book club. Like Inej, we're getting introductions to everyone through Emma's perspective. And then when we actually go into their own chapters, we get a lot more empathy for them, and we learn a lot more about their lives and a lot more about like who they really are versus who Emma perceived them to be. So, in Jess, so she's first in Emma's chapter, and she's mentioned in Emma's chapter, although she doesn't have any real dialogue in that first chapter. Jess is Emma's best friend. Emma wishes Jess was in the bus with her. There's a hint that her mom isn't around, and Emma explains that Jess is Emma's best friend. Megan is second in Emma's chapter with a mention, and then she has the second chapter of the book. So Megan is mentioned. She's sitting in class, and Emma is upset when she realizes they're sitting next to each other. She identifies Megan as part of the Fab Four of girls who are unkind to her, and she explains Megan ditched her after her family got money. So Megan is kind of first revealed as the sort of bully character, but then, because she is an important character and she is going to change, we right away, the second chapter is from her perspective, and I think that's incredibly important. She is texting Becca in the car on the way to book club, but then her mom tells her about a brochure for a math and science camp. She has no interest in it at all, but her mom ignores her feelings on it. She's grumpy throughout the whole first book club meeting, but you do get the sense that, like, oh, hey, there's something. She has a couple of problems. Maybe we get a little bit of empathy for her right there in that chapter, whereas I think if she was like the fourth chapter and all the girls have been complaining about her, by the time you got to her chapter, you'd be like, this girl sucks. And they had to sort of squeeze that in there as soon as possible to gain the empathy. And finally, we have Cassidy. She is third in Emma's chapter with a mention, and then she has the third chapter of the book. She's mentioned in Emma's chapter because Emma is glad she's not sitting beside Cassidy. She's introduced as the new girl who moved last spring. She has a model mom and a sports obsession. So you kind of get the basics of who Cassidy is there. In Cassidy's chapter, she arrives home and she's super anxious to get to the rink. She snips at her mom, who's setting up a Halloween party she's not happy about. She argues with her sister. And then at the Halloween party, she bands together with Emma and Jess and the boys to pull a prank on Becca and Megan. So altogether, you see a very different kind of opening from these characters where they're all mentioned in the first chapter, and then you get more, I guess, elaboration on who they really are in the subsequent chapters. This is very different than Six of Crows. Obviously, it's a completely different genre as well, and completely different kind of story. But it is interesting in that there's less explicit action, but it's still weirdly very engaging to read about. And again, there are brief descriptions, but what makes it interesting is that it's so colored by the narrator's perspective of those people. And makes you wonder, is this how they really are? And it really gets you invested. So, that is how 4 very different stories introduced their ensemble cast of characters. It's given me ideas for how to introduce my own cast, and I hope it gives you some too. If you can think of other stories that have ensemble casts and then do a really good job with their introductions, maybe a different way. So we saw kind of a slideshow like this one. We saw it through action. We saw it in a very kind of weaving, hierarchical sense, started from the bottom, now we're here. And then we saw it in a very kind of organic, revealing character little bits at a time kind of way. If you have another story, television, book, movie, whatever, that does it in a very creative way, definitely leave it down below. Let me know what you thought about this, if you have any other thoughts on the techniques that the author used here. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.